On the 15th of July, in the year 1099, soldiers of the First Crusade broke through the walls of Jerusalem after a siege of little more than a month, and in the hours and days that followed, the city's fall became one of the most somber chapters in the entire history of the Crusades, a mass killing of Muslim and Jewish residents that contemporary chroniclers on multiple sides described in stark and troubling terms. We are not going to look away from that chapter in this episode. But we are not going to begin there. For centuries before that July, Jerusalem had been a genuinely remarkable city, holy to three faiths at once, home to Muslims, Christians and Jews, who had, for long stretches of its history under Muslim rule, lived alongside one another within the same walls, prayed within sight of one another's sacred buildings, and shared the same crowded markets and narrow streets. We are going to spend most of our time in that earlier Jerusalem, the city as it existed in the months before a Crusader army from Western Europe arrived at its gates, a city whose residents had no way of knowing what the coming summer would bring. We will walk through its neighborhoods, its holy places, its ordinary daily rhythms, before we turn, carefully and honestly, toward the siege itself, and toward what happened after the walls finally gave way. When we reach that part of the story, we will describe it plainly, without softening what actually occurred into vague or comfortable language, because doing so would dishonor the people who lived through it. But we will also not linger in graphic detail for its own sake, because that, too, would fail them. Let us begin with an ordinary season in a city three faiths called holy. To understand Jerusalem in the final months before the summer of 1099, it helps to understand just how long and how deeply this single city had mattered to three separate religious traditions at once. For Jews, Jerusalem held the memory of the ancient temple, destroyed by Rome nearly 1,000 years earlier, its remaining foundation stones still considered the holiest site in Judaism, a place of pilgrimage and mourning for a community scattered across the Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. For Christians, Jerusalem was the site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre marking the traditional location of both events, drawing pilgrims from across Christian Europe and the Byzantine world for centuries. For Muslims, Jerusalem held deep significance as the location of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey and ascension, commemorated by the Dome of the Rock, and the nearby Al-Aqsa Mosque had stood as one of the most important sites in Islam since the 7th century, when Muslim armies first brought the city under Islamic rule. By the final decades of the 11th century, Jerusalem sat under the political authority of the Fatimid Caliphate, a Shia Muslim dynasty ruling from Egypt, though control of the city had shifted hands several times in recent decades amid the broader political turbulence affecting the wider region, including a period of Seljuk Turkish control that had only recently given way back to Fatimid administration shortly before our story takes place. This political instability sat atop a much older, generally more durable pattern of religious coexistence, one shaped by centuries of Islamic rule that had typically extended legal protection, along with certain social and financial restrictions, to Jewish and Christian communities living within Muslim-governed cities, a system historians call the Dhimma, which, whatever its real limitations and periodic tensions, had allowed Jerusalem to remain home to a genuinely mixed population across many centuries. This protected status was not equality in the modern sense, and Christians and Jews under this system paid a specific tax, faced certain restrictions on building or repairing places of worship, and occupied a formally subordinate legal position to the Muslim majority. Yet within these real constraints, Jewish and Christian communities in Jerusalem maintained functioning religious institutions, community leadership structures, and considerable continuity of residence across many generations, a pattern of managed coexistence that, whatever its imperfections, had proven durable enough to outlast numerous changes in political rulership across the centuries. Pilgrims from all three traditions continued to travel to Jerusalem throughout this period: Christian pilgrims from Western Europe and Byzantium, Jewish visitors from across the Mediterranean diaspora, and Muslim pilgrims for whom Jerusalem ranked in sanctity just below Mecca and Medina. This was the Jerusalem that existed in the years and months before 1099, a city whose holiness was shared, sometimes uneasily, sometimes with genuine mutual respect, among communities who had, for the most part, learned to build their ordinary lives within sight of one another's most sacred spaces. Jerusalem's physical form in this period reflected both its considerable age and the practical requirements of defending a city whose spiritual importance far outweighed its modest size. The city's walls, rebuilt and reinforced many times across the centuries by successive rulers, enclosed a relatively compact urban area, considerably smaller than the sprawling capitals of empires like Constantinople or Baghdad, yet dense with religious buildings, markets, and residential quarters packed closely together along narrow, winding streets. The Temple Mount, the elevated platform holding both the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, dominated the city's eastern section, its retaining walls, some dating back to the era of Herod the Great, over 1,000 years earlier, still forming part of the city's ancient foundation. Nearby stood the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, its dome visible across much of the city, marking what Christian tradition held to be the site of Christ's tomb and resurrection. The church itself, a complex structure incorporating multiple chapels maintained by different Christian traditions, each with its own particular claim to a portion of the sacred site. The city's population lived in neighborhoods that had, over centuries, developed loose associations with particular religious and ethnic communities, though the boundaries between these neighborhoods remained considerably more porous and mixed than later, more rigidly defined religious quarters would eventually become in subsequent centuries. Jerusalem's water supply depended significantly on cisterns and reservoirs, since the city's elevated, relatively arid position meant it could not rely on a major river the way many other great cities of the era did, a vulnerability that would matter considerably to both defenders and besiegers alike in the events our story will eventually reach. The citadel, known to later generations as the Tower of David, though its actual connection to the ancient Israelite king remains more legendary than historically confirmed, stood near the city's western gate, a fortified stronghold that had, across many centuries of changing rulership, served successive governors as both residence and last line of defense. Markets operated throughout the city, offering goods from across the region and beyond, since Jerusalem's role as a pilgrimage destination ensured a steady flow of visitors whose needs, from lodging to food to religious souvenirs, supported a genuine commercial economy alongside the city's deeper spiritual significance. By the final years of the 11th century, the city's Fatimid governor maintained a garrison intended to defend these walls, a force that, while adequate for the ordinary demands of regional security, would soon face a test considerably more serious than anything the city had encountered in recent memory. Beyond its religious and political significance, Jerusalem in these final pre-siege months continued to function as an ordinary, working city, its residents occupied with the same practical concerns that shaped daily life anywhere in the medieval world. Craftsmen produced goods both for local use and for the steady stream of pilgrims passing through the city. Workshops turning out religious items, textiles, leather goods, and the countless practical wares any urban population required. Farmers in the surrounding countryside grew olives, grapes, and grain on terraced hillsides that had been cultivated for centuries, their produce feeding the city's population and supplying its markets alongside goods brought by traders from further afield. Families across the city's different communities followed the rhythms of their own particular religious calendars, Jewish households observing the weekly Sabbath and the annual cycle of Jewish festivals, Christian residents marking their own liturgical year, Muslim families structuring their days around the 5 daily prayers and observing the fasting month of Ramadan according to the lunar calendar. Despite the underlying religious differences separating these communities, ordinary commercial and social life frequently crossed these boundaries, merchants of different faiths trading with one another, neighbors of different religions exchanging the small courtesies and occasional disputes common to any densely populated urban neighborhood. Bathhouses, a feature of urban life inherited from earlier Roman and Byzantine tradition and maintained under Islamic rule, offered residents of the city a shared social space, not unlike the public baths we have visited in other cities across our journeys together, a place where the practical business of hygiene mixed with the equally practical business of conversation and community news. Children throughout the city grew up amid this genuine diversity, likely acquiring at least some functional knowledge of their neighbors' languages and customs simply through the ordinary proximity of daily life, even as formal religious education and identity remained firmly rooted within each family's own particular tradition. Local governance under Fatimid administration handled the practical business of taxation, market regulation, and civic order, a bureaucratic structure that, whatever its particular tensions or inefficiencies, had provided the city with a reasonable degree of stability across recent decades. For the ordinary residents of Jerusalem in these final months, whatever news reached them of a large Christian army marching overland from Western Europe likely arrived gradually, filtered through merchant reports and traveler accounts, its precise significance and threat level probably remaining genuinely uncertain for some time before the true scale of what was approaching became unmistakably clear. Among the three communities sharing Jerusalem in this period, the city's Jewish population deserves particular attention this evening, both for the genuine richness of its communal life and for what would eventually befall it, a fate we will address honestly when our story reaches that point. Jerusalem's Jewish community in the late 11th century, while smaller than the great Jewish population centers of Babylon or later Spain, held deep symbolic importance within the wider Jewish world, precisely because of the city's unmatched religious significance as the site of the ancient temple. The community maintained its own synagogues, religious courts, and charitable institutions, structures of communal life that had developed and adapted across many centuries of residence under a succession of different rulers, from Byzantine Christian control through the initial Muslim conquest and the various dynasties that followed. Jerusalem's Jewish residents included scholars, merchants, and craftsmen, their community connected through correspondence, trade, and religious study to Jewish communities scattered across Egypt, Babylon, and the wider Mediterranean world, a network of relationships historians have been able to reconstruct partly through documents preserved in Cairo's famous Geniza archive, a treasure trove of medieval Jewish correspondence and legal documents that has illuminated daily life for this entire region during this period. Pilgrimage to Jerusalem held particular significance for Jewish visitors, many traveling considerable distances specifically to pray at the remaining wall of the ancient temple complex, continuing a tradition of mourning and hope that had persisted for nearly 1,000 years since the temple's destruction by Rome. The community's relationship with the city's Muslim majority and its Christian minority involved the full range of ordinary human interaction, genuine friendships and business partnerships, alongside occasional tension or dispute, a lived reality considerably more complex and human than any simple narrative of either harmony or hostility could fully capture. As news of the approaching Crusader army reached Jerusalem, the city's Jewish community had particular reason for genuine alarm, since reports had already reached the wider region describing serious violence against Jewish communities in the Rhineland cities of Worms, Mainz, and Cologne during the Crusades' initial mobilization in Europe, attacks in which local Christian mobs, inspired by the same religious fervor driving the crusade itself, had killed significant numbers of Jewish residents who refused forced conversion. This grim precedent meant that Jerusalem's Jewish community approached the coming crisis with a level of specific, well-founded dread that distinguished their experience from that of their Muslim neighbors, even as both communities ultimately shared in the catastrophe that would follow. The army that would eventually arrive at Jerusalem's gates had its origins in events that had begun 4 years earlier, and thousands of miles away, in a field in central France. In the year 1095, Pope Urban II delivered a sermon at the Council of Clermont, calling on Christian knights and nobles to march east and reclaim Jerusalem and the wider Holy Land from Muslim rule. A call motivated by a genuine mixture of religious devotion, the Byzantine Empire's own request for military assistance against Turkish incursions into Anatolia, and the complicated political ambitions of various European nobles eager for land, status, or simply an outlet for the endemic warfare that plagued much of Western European society during this period. The response exceeded what even the Pope himself likely anticipated. Tens of thousands of people, from great noble lords commanding their own private armies to ordinary peasants swept up in genuine religious fervor, setting out on the long overland and sea journey toward the eastern Mediterranean. This popular enthusiasm produced its own tragic early chapter well before the main Crusader armies had even properly organized, as a wave of religious fervor swept through communities along the Rhine, and local mobs, often led by lesser knights and inflamed preachers rather than the Crusades' official leadership, turned this fervor into deadly violence against Jewish communities who had lived in these German cities for generations, killing hundreds of Jewish men, women and children who refused conversion, in events that Jewish chronicle tradition would remember and mourn for centuries afterward as a foundational trauma of the crusading era. The official Crusader leadership setting out from France, Flanders, Italy, and Norman Sicily generally condemned this violence, though condemnation did little to undo the damage already done, and the episode stands as an important, sobering prologue to the events our own story will eventually reach in Jerusalem itself. By the time the surviving remnant of this army, considerably reduced from its original numbers through combat losses, disease, and desertion, finally approached Jerusalem in the early summer of 1099, it was led by a coalition of nobles, including Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Saint-Gilles, and Tancred of Hauteville, their combined forces still substantial enough to pose a genuine threat to the city, even after years of attrition had thinned their original ranks considerably. For these soldiers, many of whom had endured years of hardship, death, and religious expectation to reach this specific destination, Jerusalem represented not merely a military objective, but the culmination of an entire religious and personal journey, a psychological reality that would shape, in ways historians continue to study, both the intensity of the coming siege and the character of what followed the city's eventual fall. Before reaching Jerusalem, the Crusader army endured a journey of extraordinary hardship that had already tested, and in many cases broken, the force originally mustered in Western Europe 4 years earlier. The march across Anatolia exposed the Crusaders to unfamiliar terrain, difficult supply conditions, and repeated conflict with Turkish forces, hardships that claimed significant numbers of soldiers and horses even before the army reached the more populous regions of Syria. The siege of Antioch, a major fortified city the Crusaders besieged for many months beginning in late 1097, nearly destroyed the entire expedition through a combination of starvation, disease, and low morale, conditions so severe that considerable numbers of Crusaders, including some prominent nobles, abandoned the campaign entirely and turned back toward Europe or Byzantine territory. Antioch's eventual capture, achieved partly through the covert cooperation of a disaffected officer within the city's own garrison, was quickly followed by the arrival of a large relieving Muslim army, and the Crusaders, having just captured the city, found themselves besieged in turn, a desperate reversal that ended only through a hard-fought and, by contemporary accounts, almost miraculous Crusader victory against considerable numerical odds. These experiences at Antioch left a lasting mark on the army's collective psychology, a hardened conviction among many surviving Crusaders that their cause enjoyed genuine divine favor, a belief that had already been reinforced by the reported discovery, during the siege, of a relic identified as the Holy Lance that had pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion, a discovery that, whatever modern historians make of its authenticity, provided a significant morale boost to soldiers who badly needed one. By the time the army finally resumed its march toward Jerusalem in the following year, its numbers had been reduced dramatically from the tens of thousands who had originally set out from Europe, historians estimating that only a fraction, likely somewhere between 12 and 15,000 combatants, remained by the time Jerusalem's walls finally came into view in early June of 1099. This context matters considerably for understanding what followed, since an army that had endured years of extraordinary suffering, that had watched countless companions die of hunger, disease, and battle, and that had come to interpret its own survival through an intensely religious lens, arrived at its final objective carrying a combination of exhaustion, religious zeal, and accumulated grievance that would shape the character of the coming siege and its aftermath in ways a purely military analysis cannot fully explain. As word of the approaching Crusader army solidified from rumor into confirmed reality, Jerusalem's Fatimid governor, a commander named Iftikhar ad-Dawla, moved to prepare the city's defenses as thoroughly as circumstances allowed. Reports suggest the governor took the significant precaution of poisoning or filling in wells outside the city walls, and driving livestock within the city's protection, a deliberate strategy intended to deny the approaching Crusader army easy access to water and supplies in the arid countryside surrounding Jerusalem. The city's garrison, reinforced as much as available resources permitted, prepared to defend walls that, while not matching the legendary scale of fortifications like Constantinople's Theodosian walls, still represented a serious defensive challenge for any besieging force. Residents throughout the city faced their own difficult decisions during these final preparatory weeks, some choosing to remain and weather whatever siege might come, others attempting to leave the city for what seemed like safer locations elsewhere in the region, a choice complicated considerably by the practical difficulty of relocating families and by genuine uncertainty about where, exactly, greater safety might actually be found amid the wider regional instability the Crusades' arrival had already caused. Some among the Christian population native to Jerusalem, distinct from the approaching Western European Crusaders and generally belonging to Eastern Christian traditions with their own long history in the city, found themselves in a particularly uncertain position, their religious identity technically aligned with the approaching army, yet their actual community ties, language, and daily life rooted entirely within the city the Crusaders were about to besiege. The Jewish community within Jerusalem, along with the city's Muslim majority, faced the coming crisis with the particular dread we described in our previous chapter, memory of the Rhineland violence shaping how seriously they assessed the danger this approaching army might pose specifically to them. Religious observance continued throughout the city during these tense preparatory weeks. Mosques, churches, and synagogues, remaining active as residents of every faith sought whatever comfort and guidance their own traditions could offer amid mounting uncertainty. By early June of 1099, the Crusader army had drawn close enough that Jerusalem's final period of ordinary peacetime effectively ended, the city transitioning fully into the tense, watchful posture of a community bracing for a siege whose outcome remained, for the moment, genuinely uncertain to everyone involved. The Crusader army arrived before Jerusalem's walls in early June of 1099, and what followed was a siege lasting a little over 5 weeks, considerably shorter than the grinding multi-year sieges that would characterize other famous fortified cities in this evening's wider series, but no less consequential for its relative brevity. The besieging force faced its own severe hardships throughout this period, the arid countryside surrounding Jerusalem offering little water or food, particularly given the governor's earlier preparations to deny the Crusaders easy access to nearby wells and supplies. Accounts from Crusader chroniclers describe genuine suffering among the besieging soldiers during the siege's earlier weeks, water scarce enough that both soldiers and horses suffered considerably, a hardship that added real urgency to the Crusaders' determination to bring the siege to a swift conclusion. The defenders, for their part, mounted active resistance from the walls, using whatever weapons and defensive techniques the era's siege warfare typically involved. Arrows, stones, and the general grinding exchange of attack and defense that characterized medieval sieges before the eventual introduction of more sophisticated siege engines could tip the balance decisively. Both sides worked to secure additional resources during this period, the Crusaders eventually receiving crucial timber, likely transported from the coast with assistance from Genoese and other Italian maritime traders who had begun supporting the Crusades' logistical needs, material that would prove essential for constructing the siege towers and equipment the final assault would require. A significant religious ritual marked the siege's final week, when the Crusader army, on the advice of clergy accompanying the expedition, undertook a barefoot penitential procession around Jerusalem's walls, an act of collective religious devotion intended to secure divine favor for the coming assault, conducted in full view of the city's defenders watching from above. As the siege progressed through June and into July, the psychological and physical toll on both defenders and besiegers alike continued to mount, the defenders facing the exhausting strain of continuous vigilance against a determined and increasingly well-equipped enemy, the Crusaders driven by a mixture of genuine religious conviction, practical military necessity, and the accumulated frustration of a journey that had already cost them years and countless comrades to reach this specific, symbolically vital destination. By mid-July, the Crusaders had completed construction of substantial siege towers and other equipment, and prepared for what both sides likely understood would be a decisive, conclusive assault on the city's defenses. Throughout the weeks of siege, ordinary life within Jerusalem's walls did not simply stop, even as its rhythms narrowed considerably under the mounting pressure of the surrounding blockade. Families continued to manage whatever food and water reserves they had gathered, rationing supplies carefully as the siege extended week after week with no clear resolution in sight. Children within the city, as children generally do even amid genuine danger, likely continued to play within whatever safer spaces their families could provide, their parents working to maintain some semblance of normal routine, even as the adults around them carried the full weight of the situation's genuine seriousness. Religious services continued across the city's mosques, churches, and synagogues throughout the siege, providing residents of every faith with continued spiritual support and communal solidarity during an increasingly difficult period. The city's defenders, drawn from the existing garrison along with residents pressed into supporting roles, maintained their positions along the walls in rotating shifts, the physical and emotional strain of sustained vigilance accumulating steadily as the siege wore on through the heat of the Levantine summer. Merchants and craftsmen, their ordinary commercial activities severely curtailed by the siege conditions, likely found whatever ways they could to contribute to the city's defense, or simply to the practical business of sustaining a population living under considerable strain. Some families, particularly those with connections or resources allowing travel, may have used these final weeks to send children or elderly relatives to relatives in other cities, though the practical difficulty and danger of travel through a countryside now controlled by the besieging army made this option available only to a limited number of Jerusalem's residents. For residents of every faith within the city, this period likely brought a particular kind of psychological burden, a genuine uncertainty about what a Crusader victory might mean for them personally and for their communities, uncertainty that, as we will see, proved tragically well-founded for many, even as no one within the city could have known with certainty during these final weeks precisely how severe the consequences of the city's eventual fall would prove to be. On the 15th of July, 1099, after more than a month of siege, Crusader forces finally breached Jerusalem's defenses. Godfrey of Bouillon's forces, reportedly the first to gain a foothold atop the walls, using the large siege tower his men had constructed and maneuvered into position over the preceding days. Once this initial breach was achieved, Crusader forces moved quickly to open the city's gates from within, allowing the broader army to pour into Jerusalem in significant numbers, overwhelming the city's defenders, whose numbers and resources had been steadily depleted across the preceding weeks of siege. The Fatimid governor, Iftikhar ad-Dawla, withdrew with a portion of his remaining forces to the citadel we described earlier, where he negotiated a surrender that secured safe passage for himself and his immediate garrison, a negotiated outcome that stood in stark contrast to what would befall much of the wider city's population in the hours and days that followed. For the broader civilian population of Jerusalem, Muslim and Jewish alike, no such negotiated protection existed, and as Crusader forces spread through the city's streets and neighborhoods, the character of the conquest shifted from a military engagement into something considerably darker, a mass killing that would come to define this moment in the city's long history. In the hours and days following the breach, Crusader soldiers moved through Jerusalem's streets, killing Muslim and Jewish residents in large numbers, largely without regard to age, sex, or whether the person killed had taken any part in the city's defense. This was not a contained military action against armed defenders. It was, by the consistent testimony of sources across the religious divide, an extended, largely indiscriminate slaughter of a civilian population, continuing for a period of days rather than hours. Large numbers of Muslims had gathered at the Al-Aqsa Mosque and across the wider Temple Mount complex, likely seeking sanctuary in what they understood to be sacred ground, a hope that afforded them no actual protection, and killing took place within the mosque itself and throughout its surrounding courtyards on a scale that Christian chroniclers who witnessed it described as overwhelming, blood pooling in the courtyards, bodies left where they fell in numbers too great for the surviving population to bury quickly. We do not need to invent or embellish this. The chroniclers who were present already described it in these terms: soldiers moving from house to house, corpses filling streets that had, only days earlier, carried the ordinary daily traffic of merchants, children, and worshippers we spent our earlier chapters walking through. Jerusalem's Jewish community suffered its own particular catastrophe during this same period. A significant number of Jewish residents had gathered for shelter inside one of the city's main synagogues, and Crusader forces set the building on fire, with people still inside it, burning them to death rather than killing them by the sword, an act remembered with particular horror and grief in the Hebrew chronicle and liturgical tradition that emerged from this community in the years that followed. Some residents throughout the city were spared outright killing, only to be taken captive and later ransomed or sold, a grim alternative to death that nonetheless tore surviving families apart and subjected captives to further suffering, displacement, and uncertainty. We are telling you this directly, without dressing it in softer language, because that is what actually happened in Jerusalem in the days after the 15th of July, and pretending otherwise, for the sake of a gentler evening, would be a genuine dishonesty toward everyone who died in that mosque, in that synagogue, and in the streets between them. Much of what we know about the killing in Jerusalem comes to us through the writings of people who were actually present, and it is worth pausing to consider these sources directly, since they shape everything historians can and cannot say about what happened. Raymond of Aguilers, a priest who accompanied the crusade and later wrote one of its most detailed first-hand accounts, described the scene at the Temple Mount in language that has become some of the most frequently quoted and most debated writing to survive from the entire crusading era, conveying an overwhelming scale of killing through imagery that later readers have interpreted variously as literal eyewitness description, biblically inflected rhetorical exaggeration intended to frame the victory as a fulfillment of Scripture, or some combination of both. Fulcher of Chartres, another Crusader chronicler, offers a somewhat different emphasis in his own account, acknowledging the killing while framing the conquest overall within a providential narrative of Christian victory, a perspective common to nearly all the Christian sources from this campaign, since these were men writing to celebrate what they understood as a religious triumph, not neutral observers documenting events for later historical scrutiny. Muslim historical sources, including later writers such as Ibn al-Athir, working partly from earlier accounts and oral tradition, describe the killing at Al-Aqsa and across the city in terms that align closely with the Christian chroniclers regarding the massacre's basic character and severity, even while naturally framing the event within a very different narrative of loss, injustice, and eventual reckoning. Jewish sources describing the synagogue burning survive primarily through later chronicle compilations and liturgical texts commemorating the tragedy. Sources that, while composed somewhat after the immediate event, draw on communal memory and correspondence that connected Jerusalem's Jewish community to the wider Jewish world of the Mediterranean and Near East. Reading these sources against one another, rather than relying on any single account in isolation, is precisely how careful historians approach an event like this, since each tradition's chroniclers wrote with their own particular purposes, audiences, and theological frameworks, shaping what they chose to record and how they chose to describe it. What emerges from this comparison is not doubt about whether a severe massacre occurred, since every tradition confirms that it did, but rather the more complicated, honest work of trying to understand exactly how each source's particular perspective and purpose shaped the specific details, numbers, and language each one chose to preserve for later generations. Historians studying the siege of Jerusalem face a genuine and important challenge in trying to establish precisely how many people died in the aftermath of the city's fall, a challenge worth addressing directly rather than passing over. Contemporary Christian chronicles offer figures that, read literally, would suggest death tolls reaching into the tens of thousands, numbers that some modern historians consider plausible given Jerusalem's population at the time, while others argue these figures reflect the rhetorical conventions of medieval chronicle writing, in which large numbers often served symbolic or theological purposes, emphasizing the totality of a Christian victory understood in providential terms, rather than functioning as careful demographic accounting. Muslim and Jewish sources, while confirming the massacre's essential character and severity, do not always provide the kind of specific numerical detail that would allow modern historians to arrive at a confident, precise figure independent of the Christian chronicle tradition. Modern historical demography, applying what we know about Jerusalem's likely population size during this period, suggests that the highest chronicle estimates may indeed be exaggerated, though this scholarly caution about precise numbers should not be mistaken for any doubt about the massacre's fundamental historical reality or its severity. Some historians have attempted more conservative estimates, suggesting a death toll more plausibly in the low thousands to perhaps 10,000, still an enormous and catastrophic figure for a city of Jerusalem's actual size, even if considerably below the most dramatic chronicle claims. This tension between honest scholarly caution about specific figures and clear historical certainty that a genuine, severe atrocity occurred is not a contradiction, but rather an example of the kind of careful, honest historical thinking this series tries to model consistently. We can say with confidence that Crusader forces killed a very large number of Muslim and Jewish civilians in Jerusalem following the city's fall, that this killing was largely indiscriminate rather than limited to combatants, that it included the burning of a place of religious refuge with people still inside, and that it left a lasting, painful mark on the historical memory of multiple faith communities connected to this city. We can also say, with equal honesty, that the precise numerical scale of this atrocity remains genuinely debated among careful historians, a debate about counting, not a debate about whether something terrible occurred. In the aftermath of the conquest, the Crusaders moved quickly to establish a new political order in Jerusalem, transforming the city from a conquest into the capital of a new Christian state. Godfrey of Bouillon was chosen to lead this new political entity, though he reportedly declined the title of king in the city where Christ himself had worn a crown of thorns, accepting instead a more modest title reflecting his role as defender and ruler of the Holy Sepulchre. This new state, which historians call the Kingdom of Jerusalem, represented the first of several Crusader states established in the Levant during this period, its existence fundamentally reshaping the region's political and religious landscape for nearly 2 centuries to come. The city's surviving Muslim and Jewish populations, those who had not been killed in the immediate aftermath of the conquest, faced significantly altered circumstances under the new Christian administration, various restrictions and changes in status reflecting the new political reality, and for a period, Jerusalem's Muslim and Jewish communities were effectively barred from residing within the city at all, a policy that would only gradually soften in the decades that followed, as the new kingdom's practical need for a functioning economy and skilled population reasserted itself over strict religious exclusion. Christian pilgrims and settlers began arriving from Europe in the years following the conquest, gradually reshaping the city's population and character. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre and other Christian religious sites receiving renewed attention and investment from the new Crusader authorities, the Dome of the Rock itself repurposed for a period as a Christian church before its eventual return to Islamic use decades later. News of Jerusalem's fall and the accompanying massacre spread throughout the wider Islamic world in the years that followed, becoming a significant motivating factor in subsequent calls for jihad against Crusader states, a historical memory that would eventually contribute to the mobilization that, later in the 12th century, would see Jerusalem return to Muslim control under the leadership of the Sultan Saladin, whose own conduct upon retaking the city in 1187, generally sparing the Christian population and permitting an orderly departure or ransom for residents, stood in deliberate and widely noted contrast to the events of 1099. In this sense, the events of July 1099 did not simply conclude a single military campaign, but set in motion nearly 2 centuries of continued conflict, negotiation, and shifting control over a city whose sacred significance to 3 faiths ensured that its fate would remain a matter of profound importance to communities far beyond its own walls. Jerusalem's history did not end with the events of 1099, and it is worth considering, before we close this account, how this single dramatic episode fits within the city's much longer, considerably more complex story. Jerusalem had already changed hands numerous times across the centuries before the Crusaders arrived, and it would change hands several more times in the centuries that followed. Saladin's reconquest in 1187, further Crusader periods, Mamluk, and later Ottoman rule, each transition carrying its own particular history of conflict, negotiation, and in many periods, renewed coexistence among the city's diverse religious communities. This longer view does not diminish the genuine severity of what occurred in 1099, but it does offer important context. The massacre that followed the First Crusade's conquest, terrible as it was, represented one especially dark chapter within a much longer history that also includes long periods of the multi-religious coexistence we explored earlier in this account, coexistence that would, in various forms, reassert itself again in Jerusalem's history, even after this particular atrocity. Historians and religious communities today continue to grapple with how to remember and teach this history responsibly, and this series' own approach, telling the story honestly without either minimizing its horror or reducing it to simple morality tale, reflects a broader challenge facing anyone who studies this period seriously. The city itself, its physical fabric layered with the accumulated history of every community that has ever called it holy, continues to bear witness to this complex, often painful history, its stones holding memory in ways that written chronicles alone cannot fully capture. For the families who lived through the events of that July, whatever their faith, whatever their fate, their individual stories mostly remain unrecorded by history, their names lost even as the broader event that ended or transformed their lives became one of the defining episodes of an entire era. It is these unnamed individuals, ultimately, that this account has tried hardest to honor, not through dwelling on the details of their suffering, but through insisting, throughout our time together, that they lived full, ordinary lives before that July. Lives worth remembering in their own right, entirely apart from the tragic way so many of them came to be remembered by history at all. This account closes by returning, deliberately, to where it began. A city held sacred by three separate religious traditions, each with genuine, deeply felt claims to its holiness. This shared sanctity, which had allowed centuries of imperfect but genuine coexistence before 1099, did not disappear because of the tragedy that occurred that July, however severely that event damaged trust and safety for the communities directly affected. In the centuries since, Jerusalem has continued to hold this same complicated, layered significance, its holy sites still visited by pilgrims of all three faiths, its history still studied, debated, and mourned by scholars and communities who recognize that honest engagement with difficult history serves understanding far better than either denial or exploitation ever could. The Dome of the Rock still rises above the Temple Mount today. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre still marks its traditional sacred ground, and Jewish prayer still continues at the remaining wall of the ancient temple. Three traditions still sharing, however uneasily at times, the same relatively small stretch of ancient hillside that has drawn pilgrims and conflict alike for thousands of years. Understanding what happened in 1099, honestly and without flinching, matters precisely because this history continues to shape how these three communities understand both their shared city and each other, even now, many centuries later. This account has tried to hold both truths together, the genuine, sometimes remarkable coexistence that characterized so much of Jerusalem's history, and the genuine, severe atrocity that occurred when that coexistence broke down catastrophically in the summer of 1099. Both truths belong to this city's real history. Neither one erases the other. There is a single stretch of stone in Jerusalem, older than the Crusaders, older than the dome above it, older even than the empire that first destroyed the temple it once supported, and it is still standing. People still come to it. Some rest their hands flat against it and say nothing at all. Some fold small pieces of paper into its cracks, prayers written in languages the original builders never spoke. Some simply stand a while and then leave, the way people leave any place that holds more history than a single visit can absorb. The stone does not know what year it is. It did not know in 1099 either. It has stood through the summer we spent this account describing, and through the many summers before and after it, patient in a way only very old stone can be. If a craftsman from the city we walked through earlier could somehow stand at that same wall today, he would recognize almost nothing of the skyline around it, and yet he might recognize, in the posture of a stranger with a hand pressed to old stone, something entirely familiar. People still come here to be near something they believe is holy. That much, at least, the centuries have not managed to end. Rest well, wherever you are listening from.